She screamed what money like I was some stranger, but it was my name on the loan papers that saved their house. That night, I couldn't sleep. The silence in my kitchen felt louder than ever. I had given them $418,000. Now I was locked out of their lives. So I asked myself, what happens when a mother stops knocking on a door that was never meant to open again? I used to make cornbread every Saturday, just like clockwork. The old cast iron skillet, the buttermilk, the quiet hum of the radio in the background. It was the one time of the week my son Ronald and his wife Kelsey would stop by. They always came hungry, always left full. I never asked for much, just that they remember who used to pack lunch into foil every morning and who stayed up folding their laundry when they were too tired to move. It was 3 weeks after Ronald lost his job that they knocked on my door late at night. No warning. Kelsey's mascara had run clear to her jawline. Ronald looked like a man carrying cement on his back. He said the house was at risk. Something about missed payments and the bank closing in. He needed help. I listened. I didn't interrupt. Then I opened the drawer by the fridge and pulled out the folder where I kept the emergency numbers. I also pulled out the checkbook. $418,000. That's how much it took to stop the bank from taking their home. I cashed in my retirement stock, sold the little cabin in Montana that James and I had bought 30 years ago. Kelsey cried on my shoulder. Ronald signed the handwritten loan agreement. I still remember his hand trembling. He promised they'd pay me back in full within a year. Promised it 3 times. I didn't ask him to. He did that on his own. The first 2 months after that, they still came by on Saturdays. But something changed. Kelsey stopped bringing dessert. Ronald stopped taking his shoes off. They stopped staying for coffee. By the 3rd month, they didn't come at all. I still baked the cornbread, just in case. One Saturday, I took the bus out to Oldham County. I hadn't seen them in over 4 weeks. I figured I'd surprise them with lunch. A roast chicken, still warm, wrapped in foil. I walked up the steps to their front door and knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Then I heard voices inside. The curtain moved. A second later, the door opened just a crack. Kelsey stood there, one hand on the door, the other on her hip. She said now was not a good time. Her tone was flat. No warmth, no hesitation, just that. I stood there holding that roast chicken like a fool, like I had walked into someone else's life. Kelsey didn't even look at the food. Ronald never came to the door. That was the moment something in me started to pull back, like when the tide changes and you don't feel it right away, but you know it's happening. Have you ever given someone everything you could, then watched them pretend you never existed? That day didn't break me, but it bent something, and once it bent, it kept bending, quietly, slowly, until it stopped being about money at all. And just like that, Saturday stopped being Saturday. It was the Monday after that visit when the mailman dropped off a thick envelope at my door. No return address, just my name scribbled in a familiar hand. I knew Kelsey's handwriting, the same hand that used to leave thank you notes after dinner, the same hand that now barely opened a door. Inside was a short letter, 5 lines. She thanked me for my generosity, said things were looking up for them, and asked if I could consider the loan a gift instead. Her last sentence read, "We would prefer to move forward without debts hanging over us." I sat at the kitchen table with the letter in one hand and the signed loan agreement in the other. The agreement Ronald had written himself, his signature right next to mine. A lump formed in my throat, but I didn't cry. I just read the letter again and again. I folded it once, then placed it neatly in a folder labeled House Records. 2 days later, Ronald called. Not to explain, not to ask how I was. He said they were refinancing and needed to take my name off the house title. He talked fast, said it was just a formality. I listened, didn't interrupt. Then I said no. My voice was steady, not angry, not sad, just clear. There was a long pause on his end. Then he hung up. For the next few weeks, things got quiet. Too quiet. Ronald didn't call again. Kelsey didn't send anything else. The silence grew thick around me. Every time the phone rang, part of me still hoped it was Ronald calling to talk, not to ask. But it never was. By mid-June, I received another notice. This one from the title office, a formal request to relinquish any claim to the property. Attached was a typed letter from a real estate attorney I had never met. Polite, but direct. They were trying to remove my name through a quit-claim process. Quietly, legally, permanently. I didn't respond. Instead, I called Helen. Helen and I met 35 years ago working the food car on Amtrak. She was sharp as a tack and never forgot a single detail. She retired 5 years before me, but we still had lunch every month. She had once helped her niece through a property dispute and knew a thing or two about housing law. I told her everything. She didn't say much, just asked me to bring the documents. We sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours, going through every page. The agreement Ronald signed. My bank transfer slips, the mortgage statements. Helen looked at me over her glasses and said one sentence that stuck. You have enough to hold your ground. I took a deep breath. For the first time in months, I felt something settle in my chest. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't being dramatic. I was being erased. And I wasn't going to let that happen quietly. That night, I made 2 copies of every document. One set went into a new folder labeled legal, the other into a fireproof box I kept under my bed. I didn't know what I would do next, but I knew this much. I would not be signing anything, and I would not be giving away the last thing tying me to the life I had built. Whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms. And this time, I would not be caught off guard. The next time I heard from Ronald, it wasn't his voice on the line. It was a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. A woman with a crisp, almost cheerful tone introduced herself as the representative from their new mortgage agency. She said she was calling to follow up on my pending removal from the property title and to schedule a time for me to sign the quitclaim deed. She said it like I had already agreed, like my consent was just a formality. I didn't return the call. Instead, I opened my old metal filing cabinet and pulled out a manila folder labeled Christmas 2009. I had saved every holiday photo from that year. It was the last one before James passed. We were all wearing matching green sweaters, even Kelsey. Back then, she used to bring sweet potato pie in her own glass dish. I found the group photo where we stood in front of the fireplace. I looked at Ronald's face, full of light. He was holding my hand. Now he wanted to erase me with a form. I reached out to Helen again. She came over that afternoon with her reading glasses and a yellow legal pad. I made us chicken salad and sweet tea, then sat across the table and showed her the voicemail. She shook her head slowly. Said this wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about respect. About being pushed out of your own family without so much as a proper conversation. Helen didn't talk in circles. She believed in facts, paper trails, and knowing your rights. She helped me draft a certified response letter. In it, we formally rejected the quitclaim request and reminded them that a signed personal loan agreement existed. We included copies. We sent it through registered mail with proof of delivery. I also emailed a scanned version to the agency, addressed to the woman who left the voicemail. 3 days later, the phone rang again. This time it was Ronald. His voice was lower than usual. Slower. He asked if I had gotten the letter. I said I had. He asked if I had really sent that response. I said I had. Then he was quiet, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said something I will never forget. He said we thought you wouldn't fight back. I didn't say anything for a while. I wanted to choose my words carefully. I told him I didn't raise my voice, didn't go to the neighbors, didn't even come knocking with a lawyer. But I would not be removed like a stain. I would not be treated like a burden they could scrub out of the story. He didn't respond to that. He just said goodbye and hung up. The next morning, I noticed something strange. My kitchen corkboard, the one where I pinned holiday cards and grocery lists, had a photo missing. The one of me, Ronald, and baby Ellie at the pumpkin patch. I searched the counter, the floor, the drawer where I kept extra tacks. Nothing. It was gone. Later that week, I checked my social media page. I didn't post often, but I liked seeing updates from the church group. When I opened the album labeled Family, I noticed 3 pictures were missing. All of them had Ronald in them. All of them had me beside him. It felt like I was being cut out, quietly, deliberately. That night, I deleted the album, not out of anger, but because I would not beg to remain in photos someone else was ashamed of. I printed copies of the originals and put them in a photo box in my closet, labeled it Things I Won't Forget. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It wasn't even about money. It was about erasure. And now that I had seen it clearly, I wasn't going to disappear quietly. 2 weeks passed without a word. The silence had a different weight now. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was a choice. I kept busy, cleaned out the attic, donated old coats, reorganized the pantry. But each drawer I opened, each photograph I touched, reminded me that my life had shifted. Not suddenly, but gradually, like a house settling in silence until the floor creaks beneath you. I was folding towels when Helen called. Her voice was sharper than usual. She told me to check the local listings, then texted me a screenshot. It was an ad. A bright, glossy photo of Ronald and Kelsey standing in front of their house. The caption read, "Now leasing, fully renovated family home in Ridge Hill. Flexible terms, immediate move-in. They were renting it out. The same house I helped them keep. The house they begged me to save. The house I still held legal ties to. And now it was a rental property. Like none of it mattered. Like I had never been there at all. That evening, I took out the loan agreement again. I sat down with a cup of chamomile tea and read every line. Not because I doubted what I knew, but because I needed to feel it in my hands. The ink, the signature, the proof. The next morning I walked into the county clerk's office, not to start a fight, just to ask questions. A woman behind the counter, maybe in her early 50s, listened as I explained. She didn't blink. She pulled up the property file, browsed for a few minutes, then paused. She leaned in slightly and said my name had been flagged for voluntary release. No document had been filed yet, but it was prepared and pending my signature. Someone had gone ahead and drafted it. I asked if she could print it. She did. I took the packet home and placed it on the kitchen table. I didn't read it right away. I let it sit there while I washed the dishes, wiped the counters, and refilled the bird feeder outside. When I finally opened it, I read the language carefully. Legal terms I had seen before, but this time they read like a goodbye letter. A permanent one. I was listed as the grantor. Ronald and Kelsey were the grantees. They had even typed in a note stating that the transfer was being done as a gift for family unity. Family unity. That night, I called Helen again. She came over after dinner with her coat still on. I showed her the lease listing, then the document. She didn't speak for a while. Then she said we needed to go a step further. Not just protect what's mine, but put them on notice. We drafted a new letter, this time from a property rights attorney Helen had referred me to. It wasn't a threat. It was a notice of legal interest, a reminder that I was still listed on the deed, that I held a valid loan contract, that any attempt to lease the property without my written approval was unauthorized. We had it notarized and mailed it the same evening. 2 days later, a for rent sign was taken down. Quietly. No word from Ronald, no text from Kelsey. But I knew they had received the message. The silence returned, but this time it was different. This time, I had drawn a line. Not with shouting, not with drama, just with boundaries. I didn't tell anyone at church. I didn't post anything online. I simply made peace with the fact that things would never return to how they were. I had loved them through sickness, through struggle, through failure. But love without respect was not enough anymore. That realization didn't come loud. It came slow, like autumn turning into winter, and it stayed with me, quiet and cold, but honest. I stopped checking the mailbox for their replies. Ronald had always been quick to respond when he wanted something, but now there was no call, no apology, not even a shallow excuse. The silence turned from unfamiliar to expected. I no longer waited for the doorbell or stared at my phone. I had stepped out of the cycle without realizing it. But something shifted when I went to the pharmacy one afternoon. The cashier, a young woman with soft curls, looked at me with a strange tilt of sympathy. She asked if I was still living at Ridge Hill Drive. I paused, said no. She smiled gently, nodded, and handed me my receipt. As I walked out, I realized something deeper was happening. People knew. They had heard things. By the weekend, Helen came by with 2 copies of a letter she had helped me draft. One was for Ronald, the other for the mortgage company. It was short, direct, and written without bitterness. I reaffirmed my legal rights as co-owner. I made it clear that any decisions about the property, especially financial or contractual, required my signature. We delivered them both by hand, left them in the mail slot, and drove away. That night, I received a message from Kelsey. It was brief, 3 sentences. She said she was sorry things had become tense, that Ronald was under stress, that I needed to give them space to make decisions without emotional interference. I reread that word. Interference. I wasn't family, I was noise, disruption. The next morning I opened my banking app and reviewed the monthly transfers. For the last 17 months, I had been sending Ronald and Kelsey $1,400 every single month. No request, no condition, just help, because that was what a mother did. I cancelled the automatic transfer. I didn't tell them. A few days later, I passed by Ridge Hill again on my way to the library. The house looked the same from the outside. Fresh mulch, a new welcome mat. But the curtains were drawn tight. There was a chill even in the sunlight. That used to be a place of warmth. It used to have my hands in it. Now it felt hollow. Or maybe I was just seeing clearly. At home, I pulled out a small notebook I kept in the kitchen drawer, the kind with dotted pages and a navy blue cover. I wrote down every payment I had made to them since the beginning, every loan, every transfer. I made notes beside each one, not for legal use, but for myself. To remember, not out of spite, out of clarity. Later that week, I ran into Mrs. Egan at the market. She had known me since Ronald was in middle school. She asked how the house project was going. I said it had changed direction. She smiled, knowingly. Then, as she reached for her eggs, she said something that stuck with me. Some people forget the hands that held them up when they couldn't walk, but the hands never forget. That evening, I sat by the window, listening to the wind move through the trees. I didn't feel angry, just hollowed out, like something had been slowly carved away over months, leaving a shape I didn't recognize. But I wasn't broken. Not this time. This was the part of the story where I began to turn inward, where I started to reclaim pieces of myself that had been scattered. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid to find out. On a quiet Monday morning, I walked past the mirror in the hallway and barely recognized the woman in the reflection, not because of age or time, but because something inside her had shifted. There was still pain in her eyes, but there was also something steadier, a kind of rooted stillness I hadn't felt in years. That woman wasn't waiting anymore. She had stopped chasing explanations. Later that day, I went down to the basement, not for any reason in particular, just to sort through old boxes. One of them held Ronald's childhood belongings, tiny shoes, a clay handprint, a baseball jersey from when he was 7. I touched each item with care, like it might dissolve if I wasn't gentle enough. These were the pieces of a boy who used to love me so deeply he once cried when I went to the grocery store without him. And now, that same boy had turned my name into an inconvenience. I sat down on the cold basement floor and cried quietly. Not the kind of crying that asks for comfort, the kind that makes no sound. I didn't feel angry, just tired, exhausted by the years I spent building a bridge they had no intention of walking across. That night, I made a decision. No more reacting, no more waiting for decency. I had legal standing, I had records, I had clarity. It was time to move forward, not emotionally, but practically. The next morning, I called the property attorney Helen had recommended months ago. A woman named Marcy, calm, thoughtful voice, sharp mind. I gave her everything I had, the loan agreement, the property records, the copies of communications. I didn't need her to punish anyone. I just needed structure and a plan. She listened carefully, asked precise questions, then said something that surprised me. I wasn't just a co-owner. Because of how the funds had been transferred, and because the house had been refinanced with my income as backing, I might actually hold majority equity. I felt the breath catch in my chest. The very home they tried to push me out of might still be in my control. We scheduled a full title review and financial breakdown. Helen came with me to the next meeting. She took notes, asked follow-ups, and never once made me feel like I was too old or too emotional to handle this. Afterward, we stopped at a diner near the courthouse. I had a slice of warm apple pie, the kind with flaky crust and just enough cinnamon. And for the first time in a long time, I tasted something sweet, without bitterness underneath. That night, I sat on the back porch with a pen and a yellow pad of paper. I wrote a list of the things I had given, not just money or property, but time, energy, patience, years of steady care. I didn't write it to demand repayment. I wrote it to remind myself that none of it had been in vain. I had been generous, even when they weren't kind. The wind picked up. I pulled my cardigan tighter. Inside, the lights were warm. The kettle was starting to boil. Life kept moving, even when hearts were broken. And now, mine was learning to move with it, not out of spite, but out of survival, out of quiet dignity, out of the soft strength that comes from knowing your worth cannot be taken, only forgotten. And I had remembered. A week after that meeting with Marcy, I received a thick envelope in the mail. Inside were official title documents, tax filings, and a valuation statement for the Ridge Hill property. As I sat at the kitchen table going through each page, my hands trembled, not from fear, but from the quiet weight of truth. Marcy had been right. With the combination of my loan, recorded financial backing, and tax documentation. I legally held controlling interest in the house. I didn't feel triumphant, just still. The next day, Helen and I met with Marcy again. We discussed options, not as revenge, but as boundaries, legal clarity, emotional finality. Marcy drafted a formal notice of withdrawal from any future financial obligations related to the property. She also prepared a document stating that, unless I was reimbursed for my contributions, any attempts to alter the deed or lease the house would constitute legal breach. That night, I sat in the same chair I had nursed Ronald in as a baby, the old rocker with the worn arms. I remembered him resting on my chest, breathing soft and warm. I used to think that kind of love was unbreakable. But some cracks don't come from force. They come from neglect. By Thursday, the documents were delivered. Saturday morning came with a knock on the door. I opened it to find Ronald. His face was tight, drawn. He didn't say hello. He stepped in without asking. Kelsey was in the car, arms crossed, engine still running. Ronald stood in the living room, shoulders squared like a man about to deliver a practiced speech. He asked why I was trying to sabotage their plans, said I had no idea what kind of pressure they were under, that I didn't understand modern financial stress, that I was blowing things out of proportion. I listened quietly, not interrupting. Then he said something that didn't just sting, it cracked open something deep. He said if I truly loved them, I would just let it go. Let it go. After 17 months of quiet payments, after legal co-ownership, after standing by them when no one else did, now my love was being measured by my silence. I walked to the sideboard and picked up the yellow legal pad I had used the week before. I handed it to him. On it were all the payments I had made, the dates and notes of every promise exchanged. His eyes moved across the paper, and for a moment, something in his face softened, but it was gone, just as fast. He said none of that mattered anymore, and I finally understood. To him, history was convenient, memory was optional, obligation was negotiable. I stepped back, looked at him like a stranger, and I told him I was done. Not just with the money, with the pleading, with the hoping, with the part of me that had spent years shrinking myself into a version of motherhood that allowed him to forget who raised him. Ronald stood frozen for a second, then muttered something about lawyers and stormed out. The door closed hard behind him. The room went quiet. I stood there, hands by my side, heart racing but steady. In that moment, I realized I wasn't fighting him. I was letting him go. And for the first time, the silence felt clean, like an empty room after years of clutter, cold, but honest. The following Monday, I received a voicemail from Kelsey. Her voice was sharp and fast, like someone holding a match too close to dry paper. She accused me of trying to humiliate them, said I was tearing the family apart. Then she hung up before finishing her sentence. I deleted the message without saving it. Later that evening, Helen came over. She brought soup, but more than that, she brought quiet understanding. We sat in my kitchen under the low light, each of us wrapped in our own thoughts for a while. Then she asked how I was holding up. I told her the truth. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't confused either. I was done. Not in a bitter way, in the way someone finally sets down a heavy box they've carried for miles. That night, I reread every page of the documents Marcy had prepared. Among them was a clause we hadn't activated yet. The option to assume full control of the property in default of repayment. I hadn't planned on using it. But now, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a boundary. 3 days passed. Then came a second knock at the door. This time it wasn't Ronald. It was a delivery man. Legal envelope, certified. I signed and opened it. Inside was a counteroffer, a sloppy one. Ronald and Kelsey were trying to file paperwork to transfer partial interest in the house to her brother, Evan, a name I had never heard before. Their aim was clear: dilute my legal standing, complicate the case. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I called Marcy. Her voice was steady. She told me calmly that what they attempted was legally weak, and we could respond formally by initiating a protective clause that would block any unauthorized equity moves unless I was reimbursed first. So we did. Helen came with me when I filed the notice. We stopped for coffee afterward, sat in silence for a while. Then I said something I hadn't admitted to anyone before. I had dreamed of having Sunday dinners again, everyone at the table. Laughter. A kitchen filled with the smell of something roasting. I had believed, even after everything, that there might be a way back to that. Helen reached over and squeezed my hand. Sometimes, she said, the way back is just forward in disguise. 2 more days passed. Then came the final call. This time it was Ronald. His voice wasn't angry. It was something else. Tired. Beaten down. He asked me if I was really going through with it. Said Kelsey had packed a bag and left for her mother's. Said Evan had pulled out of the fake paperwork. Said the bank was threatening foreclosure. I listened. He asked what I wanted. And for once I didn't answer right away. Because what I wanted wasn't money. It wasn't an apology either. What I wanted was never to have to ask for basic respect again. I told him I had no interest in owning a house that was built on silence and dishonesty, but I also had no intention of pretending none of it happened. So he had a choice. He could sell the house, reimburse what was mine, and start clean. Or I could assume control, lease it out legally, and remove them from the equation entirely. He said he needed time. I said I had already waited long enough. Then I hung up. That night, the wind outside was heavy, but inside it was still. And for the first time, the quiet didn't feel like loss. It felt like truth. The letter went out on the second Monday of the month. It was simple, direct, and signed by Marcy. It stated that, as of that date, I was executing my right to assume control of the property based on breach of agreement, failure to repay, and attempted unauthorized transfer. The tenants, Ronald and Kelsey, were given 30 days' notice to vacate. I mailed it first thing in the morning. Then I walked 3 blocks to the flower shop, bought a bouquet of tulips, and sat with Helen at the lake for 2 hours. We didn't speak much. There was nothing left to say. The season had changed. I had too. The next week came quietly. No calls, no knocks. Just the echo of a decision finally standing on its own legs. Then Friday arrived. At exactly 4:30 in the afternoon, Ronald showed up. No warning, just appeared, red-faced, pacing on my porch like someone trying to will the outcome back in his favor. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. He stood 2 feet back, his hands clenched like he was rehearsing restraint. He said I didn't have to do this, that they were figuring it out, that I could wait. I told him it was already done. He said I was destroying the family. I said I wasn't the one who had chipped away at it for years. His voice cracked when he said Kelsey had left him for real this time, that she blamed him for everything, that Evan had told her to cut ties completely. I listened. I didn't gloat. I didn't twist the knife. I just stood there and held my ground. He asked if I would reconsider, if I would at least let him stay and pay rent. I said no, because this wasn't just about space. It was about principle. Then I did something I hadn't planned. I handed him a second letter. This one wasn't legal. It was handwritten. In it, I had written every moment I had remembered since he was 5. The morning he helped me plant marigolds in the yard. The time he cried in 3rd grade because he thought he had disappointed me. The day I bought him his first toolbox. And the last night I remembered holding him while he slept. Then I wrote the moment I knew I had lost him. When he let someone else decide my value. When he chose convenience over truth. Silence over protection. At the end of the letter, I wrote only this: I am not removing you from this house to punish you. I am removing myself from a role you no longer respect. He didn't open the letter in front of me. He just stood there, then nodded slowly and walked away. 2 days later, the moving van came. Kelsey didn't return. A neighbor told me she had flown back to Arizona. Ronald stayed behind for a few days, mostly quiet. On the last afternoon, I saw him standing by the mailbox. He didn't look angry anymore, just tired, worn out. Then he drove away. I stepped into the house later and found the keys on the kitchen counter. Nothing else. No note, no mess, just absence, but the kind that no longer hurt. I locked the front door, walked to the back deck, and sat with my tea as the sun dropped slow over the hill. The silence, once again, had changed. It didn't feel like retreat. It felt like a beginning. The day after Ronald left, I returned to the house with a broom, a mop, and a bucket of warm, soapy water. The air inside was still, but not heavy. The tension had lifted. What remained was just space. Echoes of voices that no longer belonged here. I opened all the windows and let the early autumn wind roll through. Room by room, I cleaned in silence. The living room first, then the guest room that had turned into a storage space over the years. I cleared away things I hadn't seen in a decade. An old chessboard Ronald once loved. Faded photo frames, stale linens that no one had touched in years. Each object held a memory, but none of them hurt me anymore. I moved slowly, deliberately. It wasn't about scrubbing floors. It was about reclaiming something I hadn't realized I'd given away. Piece by piece, I was clearing the remains of my absence. By noon, I was covered in dust, but the house felt brighter. That afternoon, I met with Marcy. We sat on the patio of a small cafe near her office. She laid the updated documents on the table. Ownership, title, tax adjustments. Then she brought out a second folder. It was the one I had hinted at months ago but never pursued. The foundation paperwork. I had told her once, in passing, that if I ever reclaimed the house, I wanted to convert it. Not sell it, not rent it, but transform it into something else. A space where women like me, mothers, widows, caregivers, could come to reset. Just for a week or two. A place where silence wasn't punishment, but peace. She remembered, and she had drafted everything. I signed the papers slowly. When I placed the pen down, I looked at her and realized I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. Not Ronald's call, not Kelsey's apology, not even closure, because what I had now was presence. That night, I went back to the house, not to sleep there, but just to sit. I brought a folding chair and placed it right in the middle of the living room. Then I turned off all the lights and listened to the creaks in the walls, the shift of the foundation. It wasn't eerie, it was honest. In that dark, I spoke aloud for the first time in weeks. I said thank you. Not to anyone in particular, just to the house, for holding so much, for surviving every silence, for waiting patiently. The next day, I brought Helen with me. She walked through the rooms, paused in the hallway, and said it felt different. She smiled when I told her about the foundation. Then she looked around and said the best part was that it still felt like a home. Not a project, not a symbol, just something steady. Later that week, the first email came in. It was from a friend of Helen's, a woman in her 60s who had just finalized her divorce and didn't know where to go next. I told her the house would be ready in 2 weeks. She cried when she responded. She said she didn't need much, just quiet and kindness. I knew exactly what she meant. By Friday, I had bought a new set of linens, 3 rocking chairs, and a kettle that whistled like the one my mother used to own. The house was almost ready, and for the first time in a long while, so was I. I arrived early that morning with a basket of groceries and 2 jars of homemade plum jam. The woman who was staying that week, her name was Geneva, had asked for simple things: oatmeal, tea, a chair by the window. She said she hadn't sat still in months. Divorce paperwork, moving out, losing the family dog, the silence afterward. She had stopped hearing her own thoughts. Geneva cried when she saw the room. Not loud, not heavy, just quiet tears as she folded her sweater and placed it in the drawer. Then she looked at me and said thank you in a voice so soft I nearly missed it. I just nodded. There was nothing more to say. I didn't stay long. The foundation wasn't about me. It was about giving others what I hadn't been able to ask for when I needed it. Later that week, as I walked past a bookstore downtown, I saw Kelsey. She was standing near the display window, staring at a row of cookbooks. She didn't notice me at first. Her hair was pulled back like it used to be in college, and she wore flats that looked too small. Her shoulders sagged under the weight of a toddler she balanced on her hip. The baby was chewing on a receipt. She looked exhausted. For a moment, I stood still. My chest tightened, but not from pain. It was something else. A complicated stillness. The kind that doesn't rush in to forgive, but doesn't burn with anger either. Kelsey turned and saw me. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. But her eyes changed. Just for a second. Like something passed between us that neither of us had words for. Then she turned back to the window and walked away. I didn't follow her. Instead, I stepped into the bookstore. I bought a new journal. The first page I left blank. The second page I wrote down one line. Some things are not meant to be repaired. They're meant to be released. That night, I went home and sat in the garden behind the house. The jasmine had started blooming again, and the scent wrapped around me like a memory I hadn't touched in years. I lit a candle, not for anyone, just for peace. Peace, I was learning, was not the same as forgetting. It didn't ask me to pretend none of it happened. It just allowed me to exist beside the memory without crumbling. Helen stopped by briefly. She brought lemon bars and news that another woman had applied to stay. This one had lost her sister in a car accident and needed space away from the city. Helen said she would help with preparing the guest room. Before she left, Helen looked at me and said something I hadn't expected. "You look taller," she said. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because something inside me had stretched. After she left, I walked back inside. The house no longer echoed. It breathed with a new rhythm, a quiet, steady one. I climbed the stairs and opened the door to the room Ronald and I once shared. It no longer felt like his space, or mine. It was just a room ready to carry someone else through the night. As I stood there, I realized something. I didn't need a resolution. I just needed room. And now, I had that. 3 weeks later, I received a letter postmarked from a town I didn't recognize. The envelope was pale blue, no return address. Inside was a folded note written in Kelsey's handwriting. Just 5 lines. "Mum, I saw the center. I didn't understand. Now I do. I'm sorry. I sat with that note in my lap for almost an hour. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just breathed, slowly, deeply, and then I placed the letter inside my journal, next to the page I had left blank. It was not closure, but it was something. A soft opening, a hum of something once lost, still distant, but no longer hostile. That same afternoon, Helen invited me to a small gathering at the community centre. A few of the women who had stayed at the cottage had organised a gratitude dinner. It wasn't fancy: soup, salad, tea, the kind of meal you share when words are still forming. One woman, the same Geneva from before, stood up and spoke. She said, "When I came here, I thought I had nothing left. But in that quiet room, I found parts of myself I had abandoned years ago. I didn't know who I was without the chaos. But here, I met her again, and she wasn't as broken as I feared." The room went silent. No applause. Just silence. The good kind. The kind that lets words linger long enough to settle in. After dinner, I walked home alone. No coat, just a shawl and the cool autumn air against my skin. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned. I unlocked my front door and paused. For years, I had walked through that door with a different posture, heavy with guilt, second-guessing every decision, bracing for more disappointment. But tonight, I walked in standing tall. My life was not perfect. My family was not whole. But I was no longer trying to fix what did not want to be repaired. Upstairs, the guest room was ready. Fresh sheets, a book on the nightstand, a glass jar of dried lavender by the window. No guest was coming tonight. But I kept the room ready, not just for others, for me, too. A reminder of what I could create with my own two hands when I stopped waiting for anyone to give me permission. I didn't light a candle that night. I didn't need one. The stillness was enough. I had found my way back to myself. And this time, I wasn't leaving. If you've ever had a moment where you realized, not everyone comes back, not every apology arrives in time, but you kept going anyway, and chose to be kind to yourself, then I hope this story finds you. Leave me a note if it did. And if you're still finding your way, I hope you know you're not alone.